Welcome to this webinar with the title Technological Innovations and the Impact on Qualitative Research, from tape recorder to generative AI. We want to start in the 1960s. That was before there were tape recorders. The small kind of ones you could carry. There were some devices where you can already record sound, but that was nothing you could kind of take along with you into field work. So people needed to look for a quiet place to take notes. And well, when I started with the tape recorder, but still the cassette recorder, not digital recording. But recently talked to somebody who's slightly older than I am, and she was saying, yeah, we were still taught, to just maybe rush into the bathroom in between and just to kind of take some notes so you don't forget what somebody said, or you kind of sat down in the evening and then wrote down your summaries. And that's how qualitative work looked like back then. And I was invited, what must have been around 2015, to the Institute of Sociology in Göttingen, Germany. And of course, you cannot just not read the publication here, but it's about changes in people's work life due to industrialization. And that was also done in the 60s. I think somebody's still coming here to watch the admit button. And so they were doing data collection the same way as we've seen before. People are taking notes and writing down observations. And then when I was there in 2015, they were busy digitizing everything, because there was kind of historic study that they did, and they did that in a lot of different companies, and they wanted to preserve that also for secondary analysis. And I was there to teach them how to get the data into Atlas TI and then start to analyze the data in the way that was then more normal, using one of those cactus programs. And in the room, there was, I don't know whether it was Horst Kern or Michael Schumann, but there were some people who were part of the original data collection back then. There were, I think it was not those authors, but there were PhD students back then when the data was collected. But then in the room, there were now PhD students in their early 20s, and now doing the secondary analysis of the data. And when we talked about the data and how was they collected, it was kind of also interesting that you wouldn't get away with that anymore doing your research or PhD these days, because it was not accurate. It was just based on memory. It was on some, as we have seen, in a quiet corner, or because the original researchers were there, they were also telling how they were actually collecting the data, and oftentimes also talking to people, and then in the evening sitting down and writing up some notes. And no PhD students, unless you do an ethnography, will kind of get away with that these days. It's all then questioning about subjectivity, and it's not rigorous, and all those kind of arguments would then follow. But that was kind of an interesting view back into history. And so that was that e-labor project to get those historic data digitized so they could still be analyzed with some modern tools today. And then it was a cooperation of a number of institutions and universities. And then we had the late 1960s, early 70s. And what you see here is a tape recorder from Philips from 1968. And that lives in a museum these days. But that now made it possible to actually immediately record what people were saying, or maybe also your field notes, that it was a bit more immediate than finding a quiet place or in the evening to write. And then people had this new technology coming around, there's always some concerns. People are afraid of new technologies. They have some doubts. So these concerns that were raised back then, so that was 1972, this keeps us in mind to also think fast forward of what happens when Cactus was introduced, or when we had transcription where we still had to do it ourselves, and then it was better supported by so early digitalization, and now by AI and all the concerns that are raised. So here Jack Douglas was saying recording devices are the technological invention with probably the greatest potential for use in field research. Because of this potential, there's pose a strong temptation to the beginning researchers when that can easily lead them astray. And we had already discussions now talking about the generative AI possibilities. So, these young new researchers, they will never properly learn then how to do qualitative research. They're just going to leave it all up to ChatGPT, and it's all going to be quick and dirty. And it's very dangerous for all these young researchers who have never learned qualitative methodology. Well, we had that 50 years ago, that people were concerned that just that new technology would lead to bad research, basically. And here the concern is that also that people would just choose certain research settings or certain research questions, and their whole theoretical interest would be guided by the technology. So I'm only doing interviews now because I have the recorder. I'm not thinking about doing observation or using, maybe other methods that wouldn't be supported by the recorder. And there was also then the fear that you could only access public data, so things that people were willing to share. And because they had to, when they had to speak in a recorder, then it was more frozen in time. It was not as fleeting as in the conversation. And so there was that fear that there would be loss of access to experiences of people. People wouldn't really be able to tell that. But of course, you always have people who are concerned, who have expressed fears, and other people who are very excited about these new technologies, and who also see that there are potentials also in new technologies. You could actually capture data that you weren't able to capture before. So it's always, both sides. You have, I guess, with a lot of new products, and also in research, I guess you have early adopters, and then you have the people who kind of just, first look what other people do. And still with using the application of Cactus, or computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, we're still people who have not heard about it, or don't want to use it, or kind of have a workaround and kind of use Excel or Word. And we have now 35 years about qualitative computing. It sometimes takes a long time before technology actually is kind of going through all, distributed among all kind of people who might possibly use it. And then there was other doubts expressed here, still in the 1970s. And Fassig was saying the portable cassette recorder has failed to supplant paper and pencil recording, so it's not replacing that, even though it appears to meet all the essential criteria for innovation. It is efficient, it is easy to use, it's low cost, and it seems to be accepted by the respondents. And the reason why he was expressing it was the need then for a transcript. So because the tape recorder, well, you couldn't kind of search back something on a tape, and if you remember these these brown things, they could just get entangled. And I don't know whether some of you were still recording with cassette recorder. You had the choice of long tapes that were running like 90 minutes, or 2 times 45 minutes, or 2 times 30 minutes, and it was kind of nice to go for the tapes that go a bit longer, because otherwise you just kind of got in the interview and I could suddenly say, cluck, the tape was, the 30 minutes was up, and you had to open the tape record, turn the thing around, and that continued, but there was always an interruption. People were becoming more aware again that it was recorded, and then it took a few minutes to get back into the interview. The problem with those long tapes was that you more quickly got into this entanglement of those brown band there. So the better and the earlier and the quicker you got the data transcribed, then your data was safe, and then you could also discard of the tapes. But the other point then is with the transcription, while we all know, without the technical help that we have today, it took between 4 and 8 hours to transcribe 1 hour of interview. So it was very, very time consuming. And then it was cheap to record, but it took all of that effort to then put the data on paper, and with your field notes, that was already written up. The other discussion that then came out was the question about what actually is data. Is the recording the data? Is the transcript the data? Or is the transcript a form of analysis? And we see different authors here. So some people actually saw the recording was the data, but other people kind of think, well, that moment where we collect the data, that is also something we cannot go back to, and everything else that is, whether it's our field notes or the recording, the transcript, that is already the first step of the next phase, basically after collection. So it's also a form of analysis. And and then there is the part of if you do the transcripts yourself, then you get more familiar with the data. You're already starting to reflect on the data, and so on. So a lot of people also see that as already a beginning step of analysis. In 1999, so that was then, at least that quote here is about 20 years later, it was completely adopted into the field. It was basically, you could not think without it. So researchers across disciplines for many years have found transcript to be an important component of the analysis process. Analysis takes place in understanding and derived through the process of constructing a transcript by listening, re-listening, viewing, and reviewing. So here also the point of already preparing that transcript is the first step of analysis, because you listen, you rewind back, you re-listen again, you read your transcript, you reread your transcript, and that's the first step of analysis, and it really became then a normal part of analysis. So here, technical transformation kind of already took place. And the benefits of those transcripts, and those were already seen very early on, in addition to the doubts and the negative sides of it, that you could have a more accurate access of the event. You could get when people were hesitating, restarting a sentence, interrupting each other, having a pause. All of that is part of a conversation that, of course, really gets lost if you just take notes. And now you had it here on the recording, and that could be preserved. Of course, there are different views on that, but some people saw that as a benefit. And then also, and that was seen very early on as an advantage, that it would prevent this infatuation with the field, that people got too attached to the participants. And so the whole note-taking was not very scientific in a way, because if people got on a personal level too attached to their field. And it was also a corrective to the limits of intuition and memory, because on the tape, well, everything was there the way people had spoken it. But then the disadvantages, because now, we have to have these transcripts, so it's time consuming to prepare those. That it's often prepared by third parties. They are not familiar with the topic. So you kind of also forego that first step of analysis if you give it away. And some people do see that a loss of information, such as intonation, laughter, silence. Of course, you can kind of put it into the transcripts. We will see a bit later there's different forms of transcripts that have been developed, but still you don't hear it. It's just like on a piece of paper. So there is something that is lost here. But then we already in 2012, so that is not the advantages were seen like in the 1970s. So it's just a bit more nitty-gritty picking here. And there, of course, there might be errors. If you transcribe hours and hours and hours, there might be some fatigue, or you get careless, and transcripts also might not be accurate. Also depend on the punctuation that either you put, or if you give it to a third party, depending on whether there's a period or comma or whatever, you just might read that whole sentence different, and that might change also the interpretation. And that's of course also the danger. If you give it to third parties, they might interpret what they hear differently than how you would do that. And another study here from Janine Evers, she did a small, asking a few people here, what are I forgot to translate the headers, the advantage and disadvantage. Disadvantage on the left takes a lot of time, could be boring. If the quality of the recording is bad, it's even worse to transcribe that. It's expensive, and I forgot to to translate that entire slide. I see that now, but let me just talk you through this. And the other side is the part of starting the analysis, getting a feel for the data. It's easier to kind of skim through a transcript. You cannot just do that through an audio recording. And some even say, I couldn't do my methodology or apply my methodology if I wouldn't have transcripts. And the last one is it provides jobs for students. And that still seem to be today the case. Even I would let AI transcribe the data. Even there is this advantage that it does is the start of the analysis. But we know, even though transcripts get better and better, it is always a good idea to go through the transcript and check it. And that is also then a chance, even if it's quite good, the transcript, but you can listen and read it, and this way get familiar without you having to be distracted doing all the typing. So I was analyzing some data this summer, and I would have suggested that the data could have been transcribed through AI, and I would just go and correct it. But they already had commissioned that to a student, and I didn't want to take away that potential, the money earning opportunity for that student. So I waited a month or something for the data to come in, or even longer, because of course it took longer time for the students to transcribe the data. And here, then there is another impact or effect that the tape recorder had, because then there was a necessity of to transcribe the data. And so people started to develop different forms of transcription. So all the way to the right, we see an interview with Bill Gates, and there is probably even the sentences are smoothed out, and it's not verbatim. It's just transcribed in a way it would probably, somebody would nicely write a speech. But of course, there would be the verbatim transcript. And then in the middle, we see a Jeffersonian transcript that has more of the M's and the I's and the pauses, and all reflected here in these little icons. And on the left, that is something that is the partitur transcript. I've been lazy with those slides. I'm sorry about that. But I think you get the point here. I must have missed a couple of slides with the translation. Here we see this called a partitur. Like when you have a music sheet, you also have these partitures where the notes are on these different lines. So here, this is also a way of transcribing data to kind of see where people overlap in their talking, or where there's a pause and there's some room in between. Or this is then also here a translation of a multi-language transcript that can then here also be created. So that was a potential influence of the tape recorder, the way we transcribe data. And another one that's more the pragmatic one is to listen to the data and write in the summary what you heard. But that summary piece is linked via a time mark to the data. But then that would take less time to transcribe, because you wouldn't do it word by word. But if you wanted to, you listen again to the original, it was linked to the summary, and you can always go back to that. And then it was not only having an impact on, from the tape recorder, then the necessity for transcripts, that also had an impact on analysis. Because suddenly we didn't only have field notes or some remarks on interviews, we had all these very detailed data, and that forced researchers to construct final categories of analysis and to also explain the interpretation in more detail. Though it does actually kind of dragged a change in analysis along, because now it was not just reading and constructing 25 concepts. People started more to develop more elaborate category systems as well. And that coincides also with the time where computer software then was developed. So this quote is from 1987, and in the mid-1980s, that was then also the beginning of Cactus computer-aided qualitative data analysis software. I, on purpose, here put the early screenshots. So it looks all very DOS-like, or this is Nudist today in Vivo. This is Hyper Research. They were all out in the mid-80s. This is the ethnograph, and this is the Atlas version 4. And that's even a later version of the ethnograph and not the very first one. So my roots actually go back to the ethnograph. I met John Seidel as part when I was still studying for my master's at Oregon State University, and he was presenting his program in one of my courses. I really liked what he presented. I had done one study where I was just reading through my transcripts and didn't really actually know what I was doing, because I had a statistical education in terms of method, and it started then basically since I felt like I needed to do some interviews for my master's thesis in addition to a survey. That's when I actually started looking at qualitative research. And then John came with his ethnograph, and it was then that very pragmatic way of, okay, from line 5 to line 7, you attach that code. So it actually gave more a systematic way of actually doing it. I went to another presentation of John, and I was done with my master's, and then after his talk, I went up to him and asked him whether he needed somebody to work for him. And that's, I'll say, the rest is history. So I started my career on qualitative data analysis software with John in 1992. And grew all the way now through these 1 years basically, with all these new developments of continuous development of these programs, until now with the obviously invention of artificial intelligence. So of course there were also initial concerns. We had a new technology, so people were afraid that people would go berserk. They would just starting to analyze hundreds of interviews, and they would lose the depth. They would just go in very broad. And by now we know that didn't happen. So there are maybe some bigger studies, but they're probably also analyzed in the team. But the average number is still somewhere between 20 and 40 interviews, and 14 interviews are already kind of a big study. But Ray Lee and Nigel Fielding did some, that's early on, they did some studies, but Max Rudier throughout the years also did some user studies, and they also reported that, I think the average is about 40, because sometimes some people have maybe 200, maybe it's very structured, open-ended question to surveys, and that brings the average up, but people still do their 10, 20 interviews. So that actually didn't materialize that concern. Then we have the distancing the researcher from the data myth, kind of, but that myth still hangs around. And there is this paper that is called The Walking Dead, and I reference that in the reference section at the end of the presentation. It's an interesting read, because they were following up something that, it often happens, people quote somebody and they quote somebody and they quote somebody and they quote somebody and they quote somebody. And John Seidel has written in a book from 1991. He was on purpose looking at the dark side. Even though he has developed his own program, he was on purpose, looking at what might be the downsides that we need to reflect. And he is quoted now as the person who is warning you not to use computer programs, because nobody knows anymore that he probably was one of the first one, along with this nudist, to develop a program, because the ethnograph doesn't exist anymore. You can look it up. There's still a website, but there's no development anymore since years. And then, access and costs. And I recently checked now new versions come out again. That is still a concern, I think. Now everybody's switching to a subscription model, and whatever you paid, a couple of years ago, you paid for like a license that ran for 3 years, you kind of start ending up paying now yearly. So that concern, I think, is still valid there, but also the learning curve. And I have been teaching software now for so many years, and it is not self-explanatory. Even, you might see some tutorials where they say, oh, you learn it in 45 minutes, or, the introduction here in 1 hour. Maybe it's magic, but I cannot introduce somebody to a software to that extent that people can actually work. It takes me 2 days to explain people how to work with the software and get going on not making all the typical mistakes, because it's not about just the mouse clicks. It's more about how you build a proper code system in order to make the best out of the software. But then, going back again to 1991, there's also another concern expressed by Aga, that form is placed over the content. So let me just read the quote. The community of scholars would immediately gather around the printout and celebrate its form rather than its content. So now, let me tell you the story that kind of goes with that, because you might not have a picture that goes with that. John was developing the ethnograph because he had some skills, computing skills, for mainframe computing, SPSS. When I started to work with SPSS, I still had to provide index, but I didn't have to go to the computer room with a big mainframe and these punch cards. So then I was after that time. But and then if you have to write syntax, that's also a bit like, you learn a bit of programming there. And so John had those skills, and probably more than I needed to have a bit later on. And then he had 2,000 pages of transcripts neatly kind of stacked on the floor. And sorted, and that's what people did. And if something had double meaning, you had to go copy it, so you could put it in 2 stacks and so on. And then he had 2 cats. And then he was thinking, I think now you might already know what I'm going to say. If those 2 cats have a rant or something, and then just kind of run through all my pieces of paper, then all my sorting and organizing is gone. And that was a lot of work. So he was thinking about a way to get those stacks of paper into the computer. And that's why he, for his own purpose, as a PhD student, was developing the ethnograph. And then people around him in his department, they saw that, and they were then also saying, oh, could you not continue to develop that, that too, so we can also benefit from that. And then that was actually true. Then he was coding some data, and then he was pressing, exporting that, and then before everything, of course, was printed out on these long, endless paper things. So you got everything, all data segment around of one code printed out on a piece of endless paper. And so people were actually rushing to the printer and watching the printer printing that out. So it was really those days that people were excited about this technology. So what Aga is saying here, it wasn't just coming out of nowhere, or they were thinking, because people were so excited about it, they were really celebrating the first printouts that were coming out of the printer. And then, of course, we yeah, you have to then also question is like, yeah, what about the quality of analysis? This is more about, we can now press a button and something comes out. And think about that concern. I think that is still valid to tools that are existing now with Cactus. You can make these nice visualizations. I've seen many at conferences, and people are very proud of, the software just produces very nice graphic or map or whatever. And I couldn't see anything. It was just like crowded. It was just like, I think, a beautiful piece of art, but it didn't really did anything for the analysis. It was just looking nice. That is something kind of similar. Or if we now thinking about AI, just getting some answer and saying, oh, here's the result. That would also be form of a content. So those concerns, they do show up again and again in the context of different technology. John also then went on for some more critical reflections. And remember this when we are talking about coding in the time of now AI assistance. So he was asking, what is the relationship between the data and the researcher? What does it mean to code? And this is an epistemological question. Some people think they can actually just name things. It's just simply there in the data, they just have to name it and then it's true. And because then they can identify it, they can collect it, and then they don't even, and then start counting it and say, these are the codes and these are my results. They don't question, they don't analyze, they don't critically evaluate, because they just think this is there in the data and I just have to name it. The other position is that coding is an artifact as a result of, as John called it, the strange and peculiar relationship that the researcher has with the data. So when I look at a text and code it, well, I've a German background, live in the Netherlands now, I lived in the States and Denmark and England. So I very kind of Western influence here. I don't know so much about Asian cultures or Indian cultures or African cultures, maybe just a little bit from visiting. But so I look at the data from my perspective, or also from my perspective as a social scientist, having done a lot of consumer behavior kind of stuff. And somebody has maybe a degree in political science or in law or in biology, whatever. And also those people sometimes have qualitative data. So we all come with our pre-defined concepts and how we look at data, and then we code those data. So it's actually a result of what we know, and of course also research questions, the focus that we have. And so it's not something that is in the data that we just need to grab. So it's always this relationship that we have with the data. And so with just coding the data, and then these codes become tangible things and then are presented as results. And I'm not saying that, I don't say I'm not guilty of having done that, but it's also always depending on the kind of research you do. So it's always reflection of just a simple content analysis. Maybe I don't have to go so much into depth and so much into reflection, but it's a matter of actually asking ourselves, what are we doing there when we code, and is that actually repeatable by something like generative AI now in the days are 30 years later. So Richards, they took the more the exciting part over in writing as positioning as a methodological revolution. They say because of these programs, so every aspect of handling qualitative data has dramatically changed by the computer. Text can be stored more efficiently and accessed in a wide variety of ways. And of course, we have now not only text, it can be image, it can be video, because in the 1990s, it was mainly text. And I started to work with Atlas in 1996 because it already then could handle image and video and audio data. And I found that interesting. And of course, that's all programs, or most programs can handle these days. So text can be searched by codes that you have attached to them, but you can also do a text search and look for words in the text. So it is accessible, and you can do all kinds of things with the data. Comparisons become more accurate. You find deviant cases, and also you can check and verify your results. All of these things were not really possible before. And if you talk to people who were analyzing data before computer programs, and also recently read something also about how Strauss looked at that. People were quickly going away from the data. They were starting with the data, but then writing memos, and back then often on index card, and called that coding. That's another story here. But that's not the coding we do actually in computer programs. But with those computer programs, we stay close to the data and with our code system, and not so much just going into the data, thinking and reflecting about it, and then not looking so much at our data anymore. But that you needed to do that before there were computer programs, because it was just too labor intensive. And Strauss, of course, he had a look at the early stages of Atlas, and then unfortunately he died very early, and he couldn't follow up on that anymore. But yeah, also other people I talked to that did analysis before these programs came out, they just kind of like, yeah, those data, they were just on the floor somewhere, and they were just working with their notes. So this, in a sense, was really a revolution and influencing the way data analysis could be done. Richards and Richards, they pinpointed like three things: that it was either the dichotomy between quantitative and qualitative research, and it would promote the recognition of methodological diversity that were all hopes back then and expressed, and it would change the experience of the researcher and reshapes the process. And what they meant with questioning the dichotomy was that back then, and I think still, unfortunately today, qualitative research has a lower status. People say the results are less trustworthy than qualitative findings. So we still see those arguments, of course, still around. They haven't disappeared. And there was a growing interest already before those programs came on the market into more rigorous and more systematic ways of data processing analysis. And then these programs were developed, so they just kind of came at the right time, reinforcing that kind of trend. And it enables then to compare to very complex data. Of course, you could say, on the other hand, it was people who were coming from a more quantitative, positivistic tradition. Of course, you can quantify data because you can count, you can code now, you can count all the codes and report how many times things occurs in the data. So, of course, there's a possibility of quantification of the data, but Richards and Richards actually were kind of saying, no, it's also the possibility to promote and celebrate all the richness of these various traditional qualitative methods. And that's was their hope, actually, that the computers would not gloss over the difference in methods. But eventually, if you think about it, they actually did. So whether it's in vivo or MaxQDA or QDA minor or deduce, hyper research, yeah, the mouse clicks are a bit different, and they differ in functionality a little bit. The main core is always coding, and then you have the bells and whistles that are all a bit different in these different programs. But we haven't seen a program developed specifically for discourse analysis, or specifically for I think grounded theory, thematic analysis. I think that is what the main core of these programs are here. But there were some attempts, I know, from the German community that work a lot more with sequential approaches, that they felt these programs don't actually do what the way we work, and they also then don't use them. But there were some attempts to put some other programs on the market, that wasn't very successful. And what Richards and Richards write here, it's also very interesting in the light of AI that we see now. So the knowledge engineering exercise required for the creation of software involves the precise specification of the researcher's tools and tasks. So you first have to actually look at methodology and think, okay, how do people actually analyze qualitative data, and then develop a tool around it. And when these programs were developed, everybody looked at ground theory and a bit at other methodologies right and left, but that was also why everybody talks about coding. Nudes talked about indexing at first, but now that term has been established, and that would be another talk. That the original coding in ground theory, that was also before computer programs, that was writing index cards. It's not the same as what we do with computers, but oftentimes people just use that one-to-one. So in order to design programs, it actually needs to fit the researcher's approaches, because otherwise you stand there, you have your research approach and try to do that in a computer program that doesn't fit, it doesn't work. Yeah, and that was the hope. But what we actually do see is that all these programs kind of glossed over methodology. I just put this here as, a lot of different things that you could do in the program. And these things were described already in the 1991 article. And that's why I found this interesting. It's everything, and also in terms of co-occurrency and finding pattern by, putting data in some tables. A lot of these functionalities were already there 30 years ago. They look nicer now, and they're more user-friendly. And there's, of course, the programs have developed further, and there's right and left new things have been added to it. But you wouldn't think that, they just started out 30 years ago, but a lot of these things that are still the core of the programs today were already there 30 years ago. So all of this, what you see here, and all of these colors, that wasn't possible before computers were around or calculus was around. So it did profoundly influence the way researchers analyze data. And then the focus will become very much with the process of coding, which is the heart of those computer programs, because if you don't tell them whether it's something interesting, they wouldn't know. And the priority was given to that category system. This is that is the point of what I said earlier was the learning curve. It's not something you can learn within 1 or 2 hours. If I already always teach people in my introductory courses, but sometimes, or not sometimes, quite often, people start on their own, teach themselves with video tutorials, and I get them in advanced courses when, it of course also has an advantage here because they can think more through their data with that. But we always start with the category system, and there's always something that needs to be corrected. And hardly anytime I see something that we already say, that already works wonderful. Because the idea, of course, is that's the core of the program. The coding system has to be constructed in a particular way so you can actually make the most of these computer programs. And in a recent workshop, I just had somebody, they'd already done this analysis, but she kind of thought, well, I wasn't really happy and I couldn't, what we got out, and it didn't really work. And it felt like I could have also done that without the computer. But I had the feeling we were probably not doing something quite right. And then she felt very frustrated in the end. But I said, but then you can just now redo it and you don't have to redo that project, but kind of take that knowledge onto the next project, because it would have meant to completely restructure the entire code system to really reap the benefits of those programs. So what we do when we work with those programs is that we work a lot with that coding system, and we also, it's a continuous way of querying the data and changing something again. So it's not like the thing is coded and then it's done. It's a whole process also until we get to the right codes. And that process that John was talking about, this is not just a thing in the data we can just label and then this is it. And this is what we do see done with AI, for example. It just kind of as these are kind of things that can be named immediately without you having to reflect on it and move them more into an abstract, more conceptual sense into a coding system. So it has profoundly affected the way people analyze data today. So the event of the characters programs that were introduced about 35 years ago. And now we have generative AI. This explains a bit about generative AI. So if you need that in a more detailed, you can look that up in the slides, but that's why I've up it in there. What I want to point out at this stage is also the point that we did have AI already since 10 or 12 or whatever years already in those programs. Now we have generative AI. So machine learning tools, we had in these programs a long time. Sentiment analysis, I think it's probably the easiest one that people know. In others, entity recognition, concept search, it's all machine learning based. Nudis LD1 in vivo then has topic modeling, and it also has pattern recognition. That means you could start to code one or two documents yourself and develop your own codes, and based on what you have done, you could actually ask in vivo to code the rest of the data. But a lot of people didn't use that. But now it seems to be coming, because of generative AI, it seems to be coming more to the forefront. But I tried the topic modeling, the concept search, all these, the codes suggested also by machine learning. And there are some early blogs I wrote earlier this year, and it's not the same as human coding. It is that part of, it's just attaching a label to something that it thinks objectively it's kind of there, based on some keywords it finds. And that's not the way we code. It's kind of missing the point there. And I also put that reference at the end of the slides, so you can look it up if you want. So that was already that issue with the machine learning part of the coding, and maybe that's also why it was less used. But the pattern recognition one would actually be an interesting one, because it builds on your own first initial coding. But then, of course, it needs to look at the words that are in the sentences in order to think, if they have similar words, then we can apply the same concept. And then the question is it always about the words that's in there, or it's more about the context? But that's what machine learning actually can do. So now with the generative AI, we can divide that into three ways of looking at it. Is the AI assistance coming first, or does the researcher start first and then is supported by AI, or was it more an interaction between AI and the human? So the Atlas coding is AI comes first. So you just upload the data and the AI does the coding. I've also written about it. There is a 1 hour long video where I explain all of that, and I also explain why it doesn't work. I hinted here already at it, and the issue with the AI it's coding is because it doesn't understand how humans would code. It looks at a paragraph, and then it's impressive what it understands, and it attaches some codes to that paragraph. It looks at the next paragraph, understands that paragraph, and attaches some codes again, and goes to the third paragraph. Well, probably by the time we had the third paragraph, we would realize, that's something very similar up there. So if I change that code, then this passage and that passage could also be coded with that now more abstract code label. And that is what the AI is not doing. So you end up by 10 interviews with easily 2,000 codes. And then if you look up some articles, or if people write some articles about it, and look at the length of the data. There you might find some articles saying, we analyzed 30 interviews, and the AI kind of proposed that 260 codes, and then we work with that. Well, if you looked into more detail in that particular article, then each of these interviews was 1 page long. So we had a total of 30 pages. That's about 1.5 1 hour interviews. So when I say I get 2,000 codes with 10 interviews, that means I have normal lengths type of interviews, transcript between 20 and 30 pages per interview, and then you end up with that many codes because AI is failing to aggregate the coding. Then we can also say the document summaries is also something that comes first, but could also work on throughout the process. But then we have the other features where the human selects a piece of text, and then now with MaxQDA and Atlas, you can ask for the AI to suggest a code. So it's a more step-by-step process. But you first select what is relevant, and then you get some suggestions, and then take it or leave it. Or you can code all data and get a summary of all of your code data. And we have all seen that summarizing data, the AI can do quite well. But again, you cannot just say summarizing works well in one tool and another tool, it's the same. It always depends on how things are implemented. I've also done the video comparing the quality of the summaries in different applications. You find that on YouTube. And yeah, so it's not that you can work with summaries in one application saying, oh, that works wonderfully, and then you might be disappointed in another application. And the quality, what I mean with that is you get a summary and then you generate it again. And it's not about just rewording the same kind of idea. It just completely gives you different information. So it's not actually the same. It's not just a different way of rewording. So we know from AI, we always get different text because it does generate these new texts all the time. But if it's a good quality, then you would get kind of the same summary, and maybe the wording is a bit differently, but it's no fundamental change in that. Yeah, so we get these summaries. We can and the other part that MaxQDA is doing is you can if you are a lumper or you have a code where you have collected lots of things, you can ask AI to suggest subcodes. And there are also videos also from other people, especially on the MaxQDA front, but I have done also a long one on all the MaxQDA features that they extended over time. So I think by now there's like 3 videos I did to include all the new features there. So if you're interested in that, you can look that up. And then we have the human action and AI input, the alternate. So that is more the ChatGPT type of approach. That means what I call it, you go into dialogue with your data. And I'm personally very excited about that, because for me, that means to going back to the roots of what qualitative research is all about. So really rethinking of what we have kind of seen here into what is actually the task at hand. If you do a thematic analysis or if you go on a theory analysis, so what are we actually doing? And then before we had computer programs, people also were doing that. But now then computer programs came, and then everybody started to code. And the question is, can we now actually live without coding? Coding was a means to an end. We had to tell those computers where there is something interesting in the data because they couldn't get that themselves. And to my experience, all the machine learning and AI is not automatically finding what is relevant and coding all of that automatically. So the promises that we see is speed. It enables us to analyze large amounts of data. And just reflect back on that, promises or doubts or concerns were raised also 30 years ago, that suddenly people would go berserk and ask and analyze lots of qualitative data, but then not in depth, but then on a very surface level. So here now we get the promise, but also of course maybe the concern here, and we have to wait and see whether that becomes true or not. For the Cactus programs, it's turned out not to be true. Then there's some promises it's more reliable than manual coding, and that allows qualitative data to be analyzed for humans without, or researchers or people who don't have methodological knowledge, and that AI takes all the heavy lifting, that takes all the work. I would strongly disagree with those promises. because I already talked about coding and said it is also not in a sense more reliable, because every time you do it, they have been kind of working on it that it would, but it's not suggesting the same codes, or it's not coding using all the codes, it's reorganizing them in kind of different ways. So is it in fact more reliable? And then I talked about the importance of that code system. And the AI doesn't even properly know what the right code is, and then produces 2,000 codes for 10 documents. That means it has no idea how to build an efficient code system. So if there is somebody who has no methodological idea, get completely lost by those kind of promises and functionality, because that person doesn't even know what to do next. So go from the concerns to for me, the promises are more the concerns here, but other concerns are ethics, data integrity, accuracy, and reliability. So when a software has implemented ChatGPT, that means that software is using an API, and the data will be transported digitally or in little packages to OpenAI server sitting in the US. For some people, that might not be a problem. Well, if you sit in the US, then that's kind of normal for you. For a lot of Europeans, this is a problem that they don't actually, would not give ChatGPT all of their research data. So it depends on, of course, what kind of data you have. Then all the concerns around how these models were trained, so ethical considerations. And for my answer to that, and of course we always have to look into ethics and inform people that if we use AI for analysis, that we do inform people that we know which tools we are going to use, and we inform people that we use third-party tools for analysis. And you can always put that into your confidentiality agreement in the before you start actually collecting data. But in terms of the bias that are in the systems, we know of those biases. And my answer to that is, aren't we qualitative researchers? So we are trained to work with also our own biases. Also the bias that, maybe happened while we were collecting the data. And of course, now we have to also reflect on the bias that maybe comes with the AI, but it might just put that debate again on the table, that also when we code data, do we always reflect on our own biases when we attach those codes and then present some results based on the coding? Or we just assume, it's all because it's coding and it's more objective and it's all abstract and it's not our subjective viewpoint that goes in there. So it's kind of something interesting to kind of also say, well, we do have to reflect on the biases of the tools that we're using, but then also please, again, bring ourselves into that discussion as well. So this is a recent quote I've seen that was an imagined scenario. AI and machine learning algorithms are further integrated to detect patterns and make predictions. So that is kind of what people wish for the future, including unsupervised and supervised learning modes for better text classification, sentiment analysis, and topic modeling. So the supervised learning is that kind of part you start coding yourself, system learns from you, and then maybe it takes over from that. So that kind of picture and image is within our own within that existing coding paradigm. And what I actually like to do is ask the question, is that not like the search for a faster horse? Can't we just not look beyond that? Because of course now 35 years we are coding data and we're used to this way of working. And that's like how many years or hundreds of years people were in carriages drawn by horses. And then when you were asking them like what they wish, they would have just wished for a faster horse. I mean, there is a sentence that allegedly was said by Henry Ford, but he never seemed to have said that. But it's more the question of, can we imagine something else? And that other with the carriage was the car. that was actually that was much better than the faster horse. So my invitation is really to think outside the box, and I really believe that we are at a brink of a paradigm shift, where we can leave that coding paradigm and think about how is it possible to analyze, and in which way, qualitative data without having to code. And going back to what I already said, the origins of looking at the methodologies and say, so what is the aim? And not thinking about the tools and how we have been doing it, but what do we want to achieve? And is there a different way to do that? So here's some examples from a paper thing, I think it's called. Well, I will reference it, and I think I can also share that with you. They work with ChatGPT, and here we have some quotes. So, and they had like 2 different rounds where they first worked with people and letting people try it out. So ChatGPT's performance depends on the quality of the prompts, and I can't guarantee that what's being analyzed is what I want. So it's all around like, we have to learn how to talk to it, and then we get some results and we don't know is that from the right part of the data, so we don't know. And then it was also felt the process of designing those prompts is a bit time consuming. And by the time, I might have just coded my data. So people were in the beginning not so impressed by it. And then this researcher thought about, okay, how can we maybe simplify that or make it easier for people? Or they looked at what were the issues and the problems. And they actually went and collected some data in a more structured way, which is also an interesting influence on. So when we work with ChatGPT, we need to give ChatGPT not just that open interview. Maybe we have to give it more structured data so it can actually better give us the results of what we are looking for. So we can kind of like, look within a question 6 or whatever, and then pull out the answer. And then they were having a second round with all these test researchers, so to speak, and also helping them and giving them more instructions how to write better prompts. And then people who actually said, well, I'm pretty shocked. I felt I didn't expect to have these capabilities because I've never tried asking in so many different ways. And we recently had that with a German scholar who is into metaphor analysis, that is Professor Rudolf Schmidt. And somebody constructed an example, and not real data, but then asked ChatGPT to do a metaphor analysis. And that professor was equally shocked and blown away what ChatGPT could do. But the next concern was, then all these students, they would just do it and they would get the analysis wasn't bad, but it wasn't perfect. Yeah. But again, this going back to the 1970s, tape recorders. All these students will now just do something quick and dirty, and the same here. And you probably have heard that as well. So nobody will be a good qualitative researchers anymore because it's all these shortcuts people take, and they just take the results that come. They don't reflect anymore, and they just gonna do something, that is it's very low quality. So again, we have that concern, and that concern also existed 50 years ago when just the tape recorder was introduced. So what I invite you to do is to try it out yourself, try to look out of the box. And there's this program called AI Lice that has been developed by a person that came out of MIT. He's a more technical background, and I did learn a lot from practicing with AI Lice. You can still, it is now in the phase where they're selling subscriptions, but you can still use the trial version with, you can upload 3 documents, and you can also then upload 3 other documents again. So that's quite nice. You can experiment and try it for yourself, maybe before you then decide that you want to buy a subscription. That is that approach where you go into dialogue with your data. And learning from all of that and giving all these inputs to all these technical people, I kind of did what Richard was suggesting, and looking at, okay, what do I know about qualitative methodology, and how would I like to see that implemented in the software? And that's why I went ahead and looked for a technical co-founder and to develop Colluder AI. So I can invite you now to take part in the beta test. If you go to that website, we have a form there. You can sign up for a beta test where we can all try out these wonderful things. So the beta test starts at the end of November. It's free to participate, and we hope for lots of feedback, of course. And I'm very curious for all the feedback, also to get how people work with it, and maybe all the concerns they have, and all the worries they have. Maybe also they're equally excited as I am, and to see the possibility to actually think about a methodology that's not relying on coding, and moving us into a next area of qualitative data analysis, the same way what Cactus has been doing 35 years ago. And I think now we are at a point where we see another shift, where we can analyze data in a different way.